Hi, and welcome back to Guff Stuff Podcast. I'm Javan,
I'm Fluffy.
and today, as you can hear, we have a guest. Fluffy's with us today. It's been a while. It's been a while since the Cyberpunk.
Hot minute.
Over a year, I think, at this point.
I scrolled through to try to find it, and I was scrolling for a long time.
It was because it was one of the very first episodes I think that we did when I joined Guff in the podcast.
I think it was when you were going over some game systems.
Yep, we were doing different game systems, and we're at the shop today. This isn't a remote one. This is nice. Guff's in the background. He's working on things. We were short microphone, one microphone today. That's on me. So you might hear Guff quip in the background.
Yes. I'll have to.
And so Fluffy, you have an interesting idea of a topic today. So why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Yeah. So I was thinking about this as like background. I was thinking about this because I'm trying to work on like a setting for Pathfinder.
Okay.
So I had some ideas, but then I was thinking like, what makes it better for the player to be in that world? You know, because like I can make all my things, I can have all my stuff, but what does that do for the player? What makes it want them to be there?
Oh, like what drives player engagement?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking other games, whether it be video game or tabletop, and like what makes me want to be there in that setting? What makes me want to play in that setting? You know?
Yeah.
So one of the games I played through recently was the L.A.G.S games, Rogue Trader that they did.
Oh yeah, the 40K one, right?
Yeah.
I haven't got to that one yet, but I'm excited. I'm kind of doing like I did with Baldur's Gate, where I'm putting it off to the side for now.
Yeah.
And like when I have time to dive in and sink my teeth in, that I'm going to. So.
Yeah. I got 100 hours in one playthrough, so there's a lot to sink
Nice.
into. Yeah.
Good.
And in that game, I was so like for 40K, I went into it knowing like of things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I knew of Aldari, but I didn't like know about craft worlds or anything. So I went in there knowing like, oh yeah, there's elves and dark elves, but they have different names. And when I finally got to that part of the game, I was like, okay, yeah, no, these are actually really unique. They're not just copy paste.
Yeah, it's not just a reskin.
Yeah. So I was actually interested to learn more about it, like what makes them in this world.
Yep.
And I was in that game, I was reading all these different snippets of like, you know, like, oh, there's that crate over there that has all these things written on it. Like, why is that there? And you know, you read it and you get sucked into it.
I think one of the things that's interesting about the 40K universe is there is that like operating surface knowledge. 40K does this awesome job, and I guess I'll just kick off into kind of the topic in general here. 40K does this awesome job of separating what you need to know versus what there is to know.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like you said, you know, there's these Eldari, these Eldar, these elves, space elves, as we like to call them, and they're this group of operators essentially in the 40K universe. They're aliens. They're doing their own thing, and you're like, okay, yeah, they're kind of weird. They're psychic, but they're kind of quick and fast. They're about running and gunning, and then once you start peeling back the layers and seeing like, oh, wow, yeah, there's a lot to these guys. You know, like Wraithbone. What is Wraithbone? You know, and one of the benefits that 40K has is they have years, literal like decades of world building to fall back on. And they've hired authors over the years. And so there's this immense amount of structure that's there, but they do a very good job of condensing what you need to know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big thing, like you kind of mentioned. For me as a player or as a DM, I like to have things that I don't like to detail something so much to people and lore dump them.
Right.
I like to say, here, this thing's here. Oh, well, what's that about? And then when they engage with it, when you actually engage with the thing, then you start to go down the rabbit hole, so to speak.
Yeah, you want the breadcrumbs.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. So you're talking about doing this in a game. Have you begun to like spin the wheels at all on like things you can do, or have you analyzed maybe some tricks, so to speak, to do this?
So like I've thought of things like, something very crucial is like the game master will know the truth behind stuff if there is any truth, right? But what about the people in the world, like the NPCs and whatever? Like, what do they think the truth is? Because it might not actually be the truth. It might just be their interpretation of it,
Yeah.
Like, it could be some giant robot made the world, but they don't see it as a giant robot. They see it as this god, this otherworldly thing. And if they describe it without knowing what a robot is, it's not going to sound like a robot.
Yeah.
So I have like all these ideas about like how the world was created and all the things that happened to it, but realistically, the players shouldn't know that in the beginning. They should know what it looks like now and what the people think happened.
I could inject a little bit here. There's a game called Apocalypse World, and it's one of my favorite games to run of all time. And in the book, David Vincent Baker, the guy that wrote it, he's like, during character creation, like as players are making their characters, be like, hey, how did you hear that the world ended? And like, so they like, and it's kind of because it's a narrative style game. It's not a DM makes the world and you guys play in it. It's everybody crafts the story together.
It's very cooperative.
Very cooperative, exactly. It's cooperative storytelling. And I think a lot of it too, Guff and I talk about this quite a bit of like using the right tool for the right job. Certain game systems are very well designed for like doing that cooperative thing. But like what you're talking about where you have some deep lore, some deep knowledge, I like this idea of the NPCs. It's like how we ask players to separate player and character knowledge. Like you as a player might know what a troll is, but your character might not.
Yeah.
Doing that as a DM, but separating NPC knowledge with quote unquote truth.
Yeah.
And that's a really cool concept that I feel like doesn't get talked about a lot. So it's good that you like are grasping at that or like grabbing that, because it can make a big fundamental difference in engagement.
Yeah.
And even if you think about the real world too, like think about how much we know about like the ancient Greeks. It's from like a little bit of text that we have.
Yeah.
Or from the writings that were like translated and then translated again. And things get lost, it's like the telephone game. And putting that into your games can really help sell the immersion or the engagement and make it feel quote unquote real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then you'll also run into the thing where you don't want to make it too complicated, that you're not just going to have players getting lost and this person saying that and this other person saying, no, it's this. Because you'll have different factions. Obviously, you're not going to agree on everything. But you don't want to have so many viewpoints that it just gets lost and there's no nuance anymore.
Yeah. I think I find one of the useful tools as a DM is I will tell players a lot of times, like I'll separate from the characters. I'll be like, I'm telling you guys this as a players. And we did this in Blades in the Dark a little bit, where like there'd be some like convoluted conflicting information, and then I would just make sure to surmise after all the gathering information and stuff. I'd be like, look, it's hard to tell. Like it's just I want you to understand that there may be a snippet of truth in there, but it is hard to tell. Like, and I kind of reinforce that to my players because it helps to kind of ground, and so you're not like wasting time.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, you're still, even in a complex world, you have 4 hours to play a game,
right?
Or however time you have. So you have very limited time. So you want to. That's a balancing act, right? Of like, how in depth do you want to go? And I think the first thing you mentioned is like in 40K, where you're like, you had that operating knowledge in Rogue Trader, and you're like, okay, this is cool. I want to dive. That's the mechanic or metric to go by.
Yeah, for sure. Because like I have ideas for all this deep stuff, but I need to be careful with like how I want it to be present in the world. Like if I have everything all at once, it's going to be way too much. And with there being so much stuff, things will start losing significance.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like if you just throw a bunch of paint on the wall, it's like you don't know where to look, you know?
Yeah, it's if it's too busy is a word.
Yeah.
It's funny because I like to make the analogy with like music, like having a simple melody and like a simple rhythm is very powerful, and music can a lot of times get too busy where there's just so many things going on. And so the effective way to kind of do that is to introduce the melody slowly or to build things in. If you listen to how many songs do they just start with drums and then bass comes in and then guitar comes in, you know, and like you can kind of build, and taking that concept and understanding that humans like patterns and like things compartmentalized to be able to separate them and equate that to a game is kind of a powerful effect.
Yeah. It's kind of like how most stories, whether it be in games, movies, whatever, they start out with something small and they build on it. They don't normally go in all in at once and just dump everything on you. If they do, it's usually to make a statement, you know.
Yeah. Have you ever played any of the Souls games?
I haven't finished any of them, but I have started a few of them, yeah.
So you know how they deliver lore, right?
Little tidbits in the descriptions and things.
Yeah, and it's like you have to literally go to an item, grab the item in your inventory and inspect it, and then it'll be like, there's your description. So it's there's lore, but you have to want to engage with it.
Yeah. You need to take the initiative for it.
And that's kind of like the extreme end of it, right? Of the like, the only lore you're going to get is the lore you look for.
Yeah. And I think as a person making a setting, that's something I have to come to terms with, that I might have some lore that I really like and that I really hope someone finds, but there's a chance that no one's going to want to look for it, or they don't even know to look for it. And I'll have to be okay with that. I don't want to end up forcing that, you know?
For sure. And there's also the idea of like preparedness. Like it's very easy to over prepare. Especially like a great example is one of my favorite DMs of all time, Chris Perkins. I mention him all the time on this podcast. He talked about one of his biggest lessons early on was like he made this blacksmith who had this really cool backstory. He was an ex-adventurer, and he was going to give the party like this awesome adventure hook, and he was a fully fleshed out character. Players never even went into that town. They're like, oh, we don't need to stop, and then they just left, and then they just carried on with the story.
Man, I know that feeling.
And he's like, man, I put all this time and effort in, and it's like the payoff was just nothing. But at the end of the day, yeah, and I was talking to another one of our older DMs. We went fishing the other day, and we were talking about like this very exact topic of like over preparing. And there's this idea too that you can have like a linchpin, like a key, so to speak, or an effect, a trigger, basically, where if you have this cool NPC, he doesn't need to just be in that town. You can have that cool NPC, but you might be able to like recycle them or repurpose them if they're not used. And so you can kind of get your idea or your interaction across, but it's not being like keyholed or pigeonholed into a specific slot.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. And something else that I was thinking about when I was thinking about this, what makes a player want to be in a place is respecting them and their choices, you know?
Yeah.
So in like video game terms, when I was thinking of like what the equivalent would be, is like if you played a game that's supposed to be like a role-playing game and you think, oh, I want to do this, like when you're talking to someone like, oh yeah, I don't like this guy, I don't want to work with him, and they don't give you a choice to not work with them, when reasonably you would think about it, you know, like not teaming up with this guy. And in CRPGs, they usually always have an option for this, like, no, I don't want to work with you. And even if there isn't a choice in the end, like if you always end up working with him, it'll tell you why you have to work with him, and it'll reason it out. So it doesn't make you feel like I would never do this. But it's like you have to do this with him because like he has a hostage. It's like, okay, now I can feel like this is possible.
Yeah, or the option to not work with them is so unbearable.
Yeah.
That you're just like, okay, I'll just eat mud and deal with them for now.
Right. And so that's also something to think of, like when you're trying to make settings, is respecting the players, not force them to do what you want them to do, because they're not always going to do that.
Yeah.
So one of the core things I had with the setting is I wanted to build off of the players' choices.
Yeah.
So I'm probably not going to have like this be like a big, long campaign setting. It'll be more like maybe like a one-shot type thing, or like mini campaigns, and time will advance and things will change based on what they did.
Yeah.
I don't want to have my own expectations of what they'll do and how it'll change. I want to see what they do and change accordingly.
So that was one of the cool things. There's a game system that we played that had mechanics in place for that, and it was called Stars Without Number.
Oh yeah.
And they have Worlds Without Number, which is the fantasy, and they have Cities Without Number, which is the cyberpunk now. But that game was so successful because of, at the end of the day, it's just basic D&D. It's 6 stats. It's a die 20 combat, and then it's a 2 die 6 skill system. The game, it's a simple system. But what they did was they gave the players agency via the faction mechanics.
Yeah.
And so, like, in between game sessions, I had to take a faction turn, which is like there's all these things, and if you guys interacted with those factions, or like one of your missions might be to like deliver this box to this person. Well, that's actually a faction move, to deliver an item to another asset, or to transfer funds, or to do stuff like that. And so basically, whenever you guys did anything like that, that messed with the factions or their assets, that was outside the faction turn. So that was your guys' agency in actually determining what happened with these factions. And it's a behind-the-scenes way of doing it, where the players, like, I think I explained it to one player who was asking me about the factions, like how does this work? And so I explained to them exactly what I just explained to you. But for most of the players, it didn't matter. They were just there to show up and play their session.
Yeah.
But the person that wanted to engage could now look and go, oh wow, what we do does that? I'm like, yeah, it literally has such a profound impact because of the game mechanics. And that's using the right tool for the right job, right?
Yeah.
I think I kind of want to touch on too, if you're cool with moving on to like a little bit like of an adjacent topic.
Sure. Yeah.
The idea of like, because we're talking like what sells a game setting, right? Like what makes it feel good, like what helps you engage.
Yeah.
How do you make a setting feel lived in, or like how do you do that in a 4-hour session over the course of a campaign? How do you make it feel like this world wasn't just created for this purpose, but it has existed?
I was thinking about the exact thing.
Yeah.
Because, a video game, it's not just vocal, it's not just the narrative. You have background stuff. You have all the background noise. You have all the visuals. It's not just like the one NPC or whatever. Tabletop, you have one game master. How are you going to convey that? And, in my mind, the best I can come up with is like, some kind of like little spiel, like when they go into a place, like that might be the best you can do. But I also don't have a lot of experience.
So I know, like, let's talk about the video games, like kind of how they handle it a little bit. Have you ever played the Fallout games or any Bethesda games?
I played 4 and Skyrim.
Yeah, so like it's that idea that you can walk in somewhere and there's like graffiti written on the wall.
Yeah.
It's small little things like that.
Yeah.
And I found that in tabletop RPGs, the best way to inject that, so to speak, is descriptions. You just over describe something. It doesn't have to be like a long, lengthy description, but you describe something more than just, it's a building. It's 40 feet by 20 feet. a lot of times, like, and Blades has got me back into doing this again. I kind of strayed away from it in D&D because D&D is so tactically minded nowadays, it feels like. But when I was playing Blades, I'd be like, oh yeah, it's an old stone building. The fascia's kind of falling apart. You can see there's like clotheslines hung between the next buildings. Everything feels like it's built on top of each other. You see candlelight up in one of the windows, and someone shuts the blinds, and like right there, you're already like, oh yeah, you can kind of feel like you're in the setting.
Yeah.
And so it's these descriptions of things that are very specific. And it doesn't have to be a lot of description. I don't have to describe everything in detail, but throwing a few specific details in that show that the world is being lived in, like wear and tear, describing wear and tear, or something like that, or somebody sweeping up dirt in an alley. You know, it's those things I find that tend to really inject life into a role-playing game.
Have you ever had the problem where you describe something and someone thinks that it's a hook and they go down this rabbit hole of something that wasn't meant to be a hook?
I turn it into a hook.
Okay, yeah.
I've done that so many times where my players be like, oh, this is really cool. And it's like, I was literally just describing like a homeless guy on the side of the road. Okay, well, I guess that homeless guy becomes important. And I end up naming him usually then and stuff like that. One of my brother's favorite characters I ever had was they freed a bunch of people that were trapped down in a mine. Like they were being like repressed by these lizard men and stuff. And it was this old guy who was like way older than he should have been down in the mines. And my brother made a speech check, basically, or a charisma check back then, to convince him to fight with them. So they rallied all the troops and stuff. And this guy, this one old guy, threw a pickaxe. Like he just threw it. And he rolled a nat 20, and I maxed out the damage, and I killed one of the guards. And so, like, they're like, we're laughing about it. And we're like, you know, he yelled mountaintop before he threw it or something weird like that. And so now he became mountaintop. And then, like, it became this whole thing, and it just got blown way out of proportion. But that's that engagement, right? Like, that guy didn't matter. But when the players decided that he mattered, he now matters.
Yeah.
And that's being flexible as a DM and doing that where, like, you know, like you just said, they find this thing and why did he say it was purple? Does that matter? This other thing was purple. Yeah. And then you go down that rabbit hole. But I find there is a tendency to want to, like, Guffs back here, like frustrated noises. And it's like, as a DM, yeah, it's frustrating. But that's also why, like, when I DM, I tend to just lean into those things. And my games end up usually going off the rails and end up wacky, and I don't get to run very many serious games. But
That helps a lot with engagement.
it helps with engagement, and it gets people coming back. People like, want to buy some blood? You know, like, just random things. Like,
I remember the last time we did DCC, the Dungeon Crawl Classics.
Yep.
I had the wizard or mage or whatever that had the little minion.
Yeah.
And I got the knight.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just it's silly things because you get attached to it.
Yeah.
And like that knight, I think it's every time you cast it, it needs to be something else.
Yeah.
But I'm like, it's the knight. It's the knight every time for you now. You know what I mean?
I think it was one of the random tables.
Yeah, it was a random table. Yeah, because it was like a random spell effect that happened or a chaos magic or something that happened.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's like, and then the other thing too, there is a tool you can use. So say you created an NPC that they like just grasp onto, but you're like, this is not advancing the story. This is just getting useless. I usually just have them become red mist, like like the wanna buy some blood guy. I'm like, I can't have this guy like just be here all the time because they're just gonna want to dick around with that all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, one guy trips, he gets plasma ejected. It's like the guy you saved too. He got ejected by the plasma and sprayed against the wall. And it's
I remember that.
And it's like, okay, problem's dealt with.
Yeah.
You know.
Story doesn't end.
And you make it happen in a way you try to weave it in. You don't try to just be like a lightning bolt falls from the sky and kills him, but you try to weave it in. And so I find that's another skill that's really useful for kind of, I don't want to say curtailing engagement, but like at the end of the day, like we talked about earlier, we have 4 hours to play a game.
Yeah.
Like you have to move along. I like to encourage my players to engage, and I like to, if they want to know why it's purple, I'll let them go down that rabbit hole. But at the end of the day, I also need to be like, hey, we need to move on. So then I'll just inject the story at the end of that line instead of this other path.
Okay.
You know what I mean? I know the destination, but I let them take whatever path they want,
Yeah.
so to speak. And I find that helps. I got a little bit off of the how it feels lived in, but I guess it was off of the describing, like how do you prevent that? So, yeah. So do you have anything else you like to do? What have you tried to make a world feel lived in? I guess is a better question to ask.
I've been going from the bottom up, so I haven't really gotten to that point yet, but I'm trying to keep it in mind as I'm making things.
So actually, why don't we talk about a campaign that I played in of yours then? We'll talk about Cyberpunk.
Okay. Yeah.
That world felt pretty real when we were playing in it. Like, I don't know
Yeah.
how much of that was from like, I mean, that has like a decent amount of background lore.
Oh, for sure.
That you can go into.
Night City.
Yeah, Night City. Yeah, and it's having a good foundation, like a pre-made foundation, is a great way of like making a world feel lived in because they have years of experience in it.
Yeah.
But it definitely felt like the groups that you were introducing us to and the people we interacted with
Yeah.
felt legitimate. They felt real.
Okay.
And I think a lot of that had to do with like some of the characters we met had quirks.
Mm-hmm.
And like quirks in your characters are a great way to make them feel real. Like, especially like a villain, right? You're like, well, why does he like sneeze every third sentence or something like that?
Yeah.
It's like, what's that about? And it makes the players want to engage with the thing. They want to know, like, why is he? What is going on?
Yeah.
And I felt like your cyberpunk world was very good at doing that. There was a lot of like open engagement, so to speak, and then you were ready with descriptions when we wanted them.
Yeah.
So
Well, Cyberpunk Red has this really nice thing that is meant for players, but you can use it for NPCs just as easily. Is I think it's life events, I think is what they call it.
Yep.
Where you find out like what's the most like the traumatic thing that put you where you are, your loved ones if you lost them, like what kind of contacts you might have, or just something as simple as what object are you attached to? What do you wear?
yeah.
It could just be sunglasses.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's enough for them to feel like a person is like they always have their sunglasses no matter where they are.
Because it gives you something to recognize and to call back to every time you see them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it makes it because like you can't show someone a face in a role playing game.
Right.
Like I can't recognize your face in a role playing game because I see you.
Yeah.
As a DM. But if like that whole thing, having a tangible thing to grasp onto, yeah, that's a pretty clever mechanic for it.
But yeah, with that game, I was focused on making each character their own. Like as one of the main gangs you guys had engaged with as the antagonist was Iron Sight's gang,
Mm-hmm.
which they didn't have much of a description of them in the book actually, so I was kind of winging it.
Yeah.
Most of what I knew is that they were very heavy into cybernetics, kind of like the Maelstrom gang,
Mm-hmm.
but they liked killing, as far as I could tell.
Yeah, they're kind of masochistic.
Yeah.
Or sadistic, sorry.
Oh yeah. So I made them like I was thinking like why are they like that? So the best I could think of was like kind of like ex-military, didn't want to leave it type of thing, didn't want the war to end. So I had like these three main enemies that I had, and I became all different quirks. And one of the ways I did that actually was so I had this song that the campaign was named after.
Yep.
And from that same artist, I took a song and used that as basis for each character.
Mm-hmm.
So like I think one of them was "No Funeral" was a song, and basically they just wanted to go out in a blaze of glory they didn't want anything of them to be left. They just wanted to go to 11 every time. And so stuff like that is what I focused on, because I didn't want to just have like just another bad guy.
Right.
If it's just another bad guy, they're doing it just for sake of being evil. Like, that's not.
Yeah, and it's like, what's the motivation? You know,
It takes you out of it.
Yeah, and it's really funny because that whole idea of like, I just want to be evil. If you want to, like, if that's your motivation, like, it's just that you are evil. One of the best ways I've ever found to do it is to make them so evil that it's comical.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing? Oh, I'm bathing in orphan tears. You know, that's because you're like, what the heck? But that's pretty evil.
Yeah.
How'd you get the orphan tears? Oh, I made orphans cry. And it's like, oh no.
And he made them into orphans in the first place.
Exactly. You know, like he has a whole chain of like economic system that produces orphan tears. You know, he owns the whole distribution chain and network, and like
top down.
And that's a quirk in and of itself, is being so evil that it's kind of honestly funny. Like you're so ultra, you know. And I think that's kind of like the other thing we were talking about on that car ride with the old DM of mine. We were talking about like what exists in games, and this is kind of that engagement thing, but like taken to a different like level. And he's like, well, we were talking about like evil guys, villains. And I said, well, my villains don't even exist in the players' minds. Like, nothing exists in my worlds until the players interact with it. He's like, well, then how do you have like an evil guy? I said, well, they might interact with a minion of his, or they might take a shipment of his. Like, I can find ways to make my players interact with them while still letting my players have full agency. Like they don't have to steal this crate of goods, but if they do, well, the guy at the end of that chain is the villain of the campaign. And I don't even often come up with villains or like big bad evil guys or anything until a few sessions in. I might have an idea of like what I want or a story I want to tell, but I've become such a fan of sandboxing, and like Apocalypse World had such a profound effect on me as a DM that I tend to world build as we play and brick off of like random tables and things like that. I use a lot of those tools. And I find that to be what works best for me. And that's ultimately too, is like a big thing, is like everybody has their own best system.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's ultimately what it kind of comes down to.
Yeah. Improving a villain like that, going off of what the players do, that had to feel very organic.
Yeah. And that's why a lot of my villains, they feel like at the end of my campaigns, my villains kind of feel personal to my players. They're like, what the heck? Like, this guy is just out to get us from the get-go. And it's like, well, he's literally crafted around the events that you did. Like, of course he's out to get you. Everything you've done has screwed him over the whole time. Like, Blades, they're experiencing that now. With the way we've run Lord Skurlock and Blades, they're just like, why does this guy hate us so much? And it's like, well, you kind of screwed him over from the get-go.
He took the thing he wanted.
Yeah, and like now they finally stole the thing that made him special, and they're like, oh, and like now he's unleashed. Like he's full-fledged. Like, we're in the end game now. Like he's got the Infinity Gauntlet. Like, he's ready to go.
He's got the stones.
Yeah, he's got the stones. So, but like. Right, like, and he didn't matter a whole lot until the players started interacting with him. And like you said, it makes it feel organic, because now it's like, oh, wait, you see that name on the paper like 10 times, and you're like, oh, wait, yeah, that name keeps coming up. What's that about? And that's how you can kind of coerce engagement too.
Yeah.
Like, because ultimately DMing is kind of this balancing act of like, to say you don't run a railroad game is an utter lie. Like, you have to coerce engagement in some way or another, or nothing would ever get done.
You just have to make it feel like it's interesting enough for the players to want to engage with it.
Yep. It's the destination is predetermined, but how the players get there, or the route they choose, is ultimately, and the experiences they gain along that route, is their agency.
Yeah.
At the end.
I had this one shot that of course it's turned into a 2-shot, because when doesn't it?
Yep.
It was when I was learning the Eberron setting in D&D.
Okay.
And I had this idea of like a murder mystery game. There's just like the small village where I had the players have their own reasons for coming there. You know, they come from different ways of life and whatever. But they would visit there, and it'd be kind of like a Groundhog Day thing that would happen after they stay the night. Someone would always die.
Right.
But it'd be like in a weird, different way. It could be like from a monster. It could be from just a straight up murder. Someone else killed them. And the end was predetermined, you know, but the way I had it set up, I realized later on is I had it set so that they could go any which way in this village and different things would happen, but they would still end up in the same spot.
Mm-hmm.
So honestly, it'd be a really easy game to have, just play over and over and have it be different every time.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing too, is like I've run modules like for games multiple times. And it's a really cool, it's like you can eat the same food, but you can still enjoy it. You know what I mean? Like, it's all about the route you take, more or less. And as far as one shots, it's really fun because it's fun to string one shots together. I mean, that's what a campaign is, right? It's a bunch of one shots, but strung together. I do find that it's very important to take cues from the players too. And this, I feel like I'm backtracking here, but I kind of want to expand on the previous points we were talking about a little bit. Of like where you were asking like if they go, because it just kind of came back to my brain. This during your one shot, let's say, if the players went down a rabbit hole, like if they went off in the direction, you say, well, now it becomes a two shot, right? Because like we got sidetracked.
Yeah.
Was there ever a way to take that sidetracking and make that your destination, or did you have to like bring them back home?
I had things to help things along back to where they should have been. Like for one of the characters' deaths, it had to do with a it's been so long I looked at it now I can't remember. Intellect Devourer, I think.
Okay.
The brain with legs.
Yep.
That was the thing that, you know, ended up killing one of the NPCs. And while they were focused on that and they were chasing it, and well, it ended up bringing them to where I wanted them to go.
Yeah. See, it's like, I like to think of it as like guide rails to the pins in bowling.
Yeah.
Like you could throw the ball wherever, it'll bounce. It's going to go crazy. It might take a while to get there. It might go 4 different directions, but at the end of the day, it'll hit a pin, at least one, maybe.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And that's actually a good analogy too, is like not all the pins might fall.
Mm-hmm.
Like not every loose end needs to be tied up. Leaving some open loose ends is fun. Even when you end a campaign, leaving open loose ends is great, because now if you ever get that group of players back together, you can run a one shot where you tie up a loose end. Critical Role did this with Grog going to Pandemonium, or like with the deck of many things.
Mm-hmm.
So like it's not just an esoteric idea. It is practical to like not finish up every loose end too in storytelling.
Yeah.
So.
And I'd imagine like if you have a group that doesn't go where they're supposed to go and there's this big thing that they never did, you can always just take that and make it for the next game. And at the beginning, you're like, oh yeah, these adventurers were supposed to do this, but they never followed up. So like the evil necromancer, he went through 3 villages now, and you can build on that.
For sure. I mean, that's literally how our Stars Without Number game went. Mm-hmm. Was I had a world seed that I generated and fleshed out. You know, more or less, I had like the main ideas, like the factions and kind of the houses system. And the first campaign we played was very strict to that. Like everyone was a member of a noble house and all this and that. And then the next campaign we played, nobody was a member of a noble house, but they were all like citizens or of the feudal system kind of thing. And the next Stars Without Number game is going to be, what about the people that aren't citizens? What about the people that have no rights in that system, that subsector? What about the outcasts, so to speak? So that's going to be like the next chapter of that. And that's the cool part, is like there's so many loose ends left over from the first campaign still. And then the second campaign kind of ended with this bang of like hitting one of the major factions. And now the third is like, what is it picking up the pieces? Like what's going on? And I haven't even made that decision yet. I'm going to wait until we see what players we have, like if there's holdovers from the previous one. And that's kind of the fun part of it too, is like of the organic, off the cuff, on the fly kind of world building, is that you don't have to make big decisions.
Yeah.
But I will say it is very taxing when you start doing it, because you have very little prep for it.
Yeah.
And that's it's kind of like an intermediate or experienced way of doing things. So I know, I think in the topic of like world building and making it feel real, I think prep for like the first time or for like the beginning goes a long ways.
Yeah.
Like, but there is such a thing as over preparing.
For sure. Yeah.
Yep. So, but it's fun to have different levers to throw, and then like, you know, it's almost like having a bunch of targets and the players just throw rocks, and wherever it lands, that's kind of what you pick up on.
I found that focusing on the main idea of the one shot or campaign or whatever, focusing on that, thinking about what you want the feel to be, what are the main people, NPCs, whoever, keeping that in mind and building on that going into a game, it's a lot easier for me to improvise, because I'd be like, okay, I know this is important, I know that this is a big thing that's happening, so if it's gonna be some random bystander that someone decides to talk to, they're probably gonna say something about what's going on.
Yeah, and that's that, like the guide rails, right?
Yeah.
And if the players insist on figuring out the quirkiness or the weirdness of the rabbit hole, I like to indulge them, but then if it's not going anywhere, use whatever mechanic necessary to kind of tie up that loose end right there.
Yeah.
Sometimes they become red mist, like we said, you know.
Sometimes it falls on the game system too.
Yeah, so just to like kind of surmise a little bit too, Guff and I talk a lot about using the right tool for the right job, like the right game system for the right story you want to tell.
Yeah.
Also, the other big message on the podcast in general is communication. So if you have a session 0, you need to go over with your players and kind of probe what they're interested in. And I like to do that before I ever even sit down and design a world. You know, like I'll make worlds or whatever and have them in the background, but I might repurpose a world for what they want to do.
Yeah.
Stars Without Number, I keep going back to it, but our session 0 for that was like, hey, I as a DM want to run a game where you guys are free merchant traders. Like you just, the whole goal of the campaign is to pay off a ship.
Yeah.
You got a mortgage on your ship, and can we do a life simulator in this sandbox? And that's the whole goal of the campaign. There's no big bad evil guy to fight. There's nothing like that. It's, can you pay off your ship?
Right.
And when you pay it off, you're done.
Get out of debt.
Yeah, it's get out of debt. It's now the epilogue of that is the actual adventure, right?
Yeah.
Like that's where you're like, you've made it. Now you can go out and do a bunch of stuff. So it's the struggle of that, trying to live through and do jobs and scrape by and pay for fuel and all that. That's what the story I was interested in telling.
Yeah.
And I very clearly communicated that in the session 0, so everybody knew going in that yes, this is the plan. And then we threw some weird wrenches at you guys, like a rogue AI, and had different players come in, because like it's a business, right? So new players will come in.
Yeah.
Like you hire new guys, like a new security officer or whatever, a new programmer or computer guy, because the previous one turned out to just be like punch it and it works, you know.
Yeah.
But that story was like, that clear communication of like what story you're trying to tell is so important
Yeah.
to helping you build the world.
think the thing I come back to with this setting I'm trying to make is I want things to feel different. Like something, part of the reason that why this is so complicated for me is that I'm not reusing the same basic lore of everything. So like, for example, humans did not do the same thing they always do, where they come into other people's lands and take it over and like, oh, this used to be elf land.
Yeah.
Instead, it's humans used to be enslaved.
Yeah.
Because they're very adaptable. They can do well in any situation you put them in.
Yep.
Perfect for a slave.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
So these other races had enslaved them for so long. And then this new deity came along and was like, no, they will be free. And like he led like a revolution.
Yeah.
And so in the setting where I wanted to start off, humans are going to be like maybe like 50 years free.
Oh wow, so pretty
very recent.
Pretty recent, yeah.
So it'll be a very big social thing.
Yeah.
And I want to have stuff like that for everything, you know.
Yeah. And you know, I've also done it stuff like that where I've actually, when we were playing Palladium Fantasy, I told the players, look, all of you guys are human, because that's what like the thing is here. If you're not playing a human, you better have a good reason to not play a human.
Mm-hmm.
You better be from another plane of existence. You better be from something like that. Like, and having these clear ideas communicated was pretty important. And like with what you're talking about, you're gonna need to have a pretty extensive session 0 or talk with the players if they want to play in this, because you're like, look, there's some elements of this that are gonna be rough.
Yeah.
You know, like that session 0 and communication is gonna be real important, and we'll also like inform you on what they might actually be interested in and like what stories they want to participate in. So
yeah, there's a lot of weird things I've thought up. Like one of the ones I'm proud of is gnomes. They're not native to the prime plane.
Oh, to that prime material world or whatever. Okay.
They just randomly pop into existence, like fully grown.
Oh,
just like magically appear.
Oh, kind of. My brain thinks like beholders, where like when a beholder sleeps and dreams, it dreams another beholder. They have a nightmare that another beholder exists.
It's very similar to that idea where they just pop in.
They
don't know where they came from either. And then also like, because I was trying to grasp on the idea of like I didn't want to change any of the stats of anything for Pathfinder. I just wanted to rework all the flavor text basically and all the lore.
Yeah.
So gnomes are inherently magical.
Okay.
Right? So they pop in, and then when too many of them are in one place, something crazy happens, like think chaos magic.
Oh, like I think like orcs in 40K, if too many of them get together, it just like stuff gets weird real quick.
For sure, yeah. And for what I'm thinking of at the moment is like, you know, maybe like 400 or 500 years before where the setting will start, there was like this horrible disaster from gnomes, like causing like a magical explosion, and all the other races, all the other factions led crusades to cull gnomes.
Oh wow.
And it got to a point where they felt safe enough, but then they're like, okay, what do we do with the gnomes now? And they put them as kind of like liaisons for this trading company faction. So there's limited to one gnome per like caravan, so it's to keep them apart, right? So they don't come together. But they also are very neutral because they don't have ties to anything, because you know they're separate from each other. They can't stay in one spot, so they're perfect for this role. Yeah. So it's something that I think fell into place in my head very well. I'm pretty happy with it.
That's cool. And see, like now as a player, when they engage with that, as a DM, like if I know, like you can kind of tell like what the players are going to be like, oh, this is cool.
Yeah.
Like why is this?
Yeah.
And so like what I would like my brain, just like to give you an idea like how my brain works. So in my notebook, then I would detail out what exactly the magical thing is going on, like what's wrong with gnomes, and my brain would probably go down the road of like it's magical radioactive decay or like something like that. And then if you get enough of them together, that unstableness causes like the magic weave or fabric, whatever, like all these magic neutrons shooting off and particles, it causes just a flux and explosion, right?
Yeah.
That's I would have that in my book. But if the players never engage with it, I just know, like, in my mind, like, okay, yeah, that's funny. That's how that works. You know, like, there's science to it or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's part of it, too, with, like, world building and making it feel real is, like, again, if they don't engage with it, you don't spew it. Because you can't just be... If there's a road sign on the side of the road, like... You drive by it, you don't know what it is. You just kind of block it out, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at that road sign, now you know, oh, okay, yeah. But it's like you got to choose for it to matter, basically.
Right.
But as a DM, it's being okay with things not mattering.
Yeah.
But for my own edification, I like to have them ready or like have them detailed out just because it's fun to just tell yourself stories, too.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to DM unless you're willing to tell yourself a story, you know, or to be creative in your own mind.
Yeah. So the hard part now is that I have to do that for everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, making a whole setting.
And changing the planes, too. So
yeah, like that's I mean, that's years in the making for D&D and for 40K. It's like they've done this for literal decades.
Yeah.
And it still is changing and morphing, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I'm excited, man. It sounds like the gears are turning pretty good.
Oh yeah, it's been on and off, and like I started with 9 deities because I was going a little too cookie cutter at first. I had one for each alignment, or alignment combination, I should say. And then I was like, no, that's too standard. I threw that out. I have 27 deities from 4 pantheons. Like, okay, that's better.
Yeah, yeah, and that sort of thing, like having a god of like you look at the Greek gods in our Earth mythology or the Roman gods, and it's like they had gods for weird esoteric stuff.
God for the sun rising.
Yeah, and it's like they might have had other domains, but there's some that were like just like the goddess of the hearth.
Yeah.
Her whole thing was the hearth. And it's like, or the goddess of night, or the goddess of like the passage of death.
Yeah.
Not death itself, but like the going from where you died to like the spirit world.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like these having very specific odd things that are like, well, that's quirky, that's weird. Having that stuff ready and prepared is like, yeah, that's what makes it feel real, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, hopefully, is there anything else you want to add?
No, I don't think so.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming on. Hopefully, listeners, you guys get some interesting ideas for your world building, or hopefully there's some useful tips in here.
Inspiration is nice to share.
Yeah. And then how you get your inspiration is nice too.
Yeah.
Or tools to curtail it or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
It's good to have you back. And we'll catch you guys in the next one.